Welcome to Spirit Seers. I'm Mike, and today what I want to talk to you about is absinthe. Absinthe has been largely illegal for most of our lives, only recently becoming legal again, and it's got an amazing history behind it, and it's a fantastic spirit. I absolutely love this stuff. So let's talk a little bit about the history first before we go into why it was banned. So the wormwood plant, Artemisia absinthium, was used as far back as ancient Greece to treat pain, anemia, jaundice. Hippocrates was also noted as having prescribed this. Now, because Artemisia absinthium was is so bitter, they usually soaked it in wine, and this becomes a very common trait throughout the history of wormwood itself. So it was even burned during the Black Plague. And moving forward a little bit into the 1830s, where we start seeing the actual absinthe as it exists today starting to spring up, France invaded Algeria. And by the 1840s, weather and heat and bad water kind of all conspired against them, and they were losing soldiers left and right. To combat this, they started prescribing Artemisia absinthium, which is, wormwood, right? But to cut that bitter, they started soaking it in wine. Again, the same thing that the ancient Greeks were doing. And so they started calling this un vert, or a green. Moving a little bit forward, when the war ended and soldiers were coming back, civilians got wind of it, and they started ordering it in bars, wormwood soaked in wine. And this became a very popular drink to order in bars, just to show support for the military. So by the 1840s, you had 26 distilleries that were producing basically what we know as today as absinthe, producing 10 million liters per year. And it kind of became just a popular drink. And that sounds like a lot, especially for France in the 1860s, but you have to realize that France drank a lot back then. If you were a textile worker in the 1860s, you were allotted 6 to 7 liters of wine per day. I can't drink that much. I would kill my liver so quickly, but that was what they did back then. They just drank a lot. So this actually started spawning the temperance movement, especially when you start having patrons at bars noticing that absinthe is extremely strong. It is usually, these are all in the 160, 170 proof range, and that's extremely strong. Even if you do it in the traditional preparation, it's still a very strong thing. So you're getting a lot of mileage for your money. And so it became very popular. And so you start having the temperance movement popping up because people are getting drunk at all hours of the day and night and starting to have some traditional drunken shenanigans. And so the temperance movement springs up, and you start having doctors that start buying into it, your snake oil salesman type people. A man by the name of Valentin Magnin started releasing papers and basically trying to separate alcoholism from absinthism, which we now know today is a load of garbage. But back then, he was convincing enough that you started having a spawning movement, and it started growing and exploding in popularity. And by the 1880s, you have this wine shortage. Well, this is a problem because France is known for its wine. It's always been known for its wine. Well, now you have not only snake oil salesmen that popular people are buying into, but now you have an entire wine industry that's being hurt by a beetle that's eating the grapevines. Well, what are they going to do? They're going to make sure that the alternatives to drinking wine are eliminated. So they're going to jump into this temperance movement as well. And so you reach the end of the 1880s into the 1900s, and you start having more and more people who are just absolutely anti-absinthe. Well, in 1905, you have a man whose name was Jean Lanfray, who's a Swiss immigrant. He drank 6 glasses of wine. He drank 2 shots of absinthe. He had, on his way home, he grabbed an Irish coffee before finishing off an entire liter of fortified wine, port I believe it was. And then he murders his wife and kids. Well, notice he only had 2 shots of absinthe, and he had all this other wine. But you have the temperance movement. They blamed the murders on the absinthe itself, ignoring all the other factors that played into a role here. And even though he hung himself in prison and there was no real reason behind it, by the end of 1910, you had most countries banning absinthe, with basically an all-out ban by 1915. And that leads us to today. In the late 2000s, we started having countries legalizing absinthe again. And at this point, now we have multiple selections to choose from. So during this prohibition, you have the rise of a new kind of absinthe. Absinthe was always known as un vert, the green, or the green fairy was. It's very common. You see that imagery here on this bottle here. It's a very common image surrounding absinthe. But during prohibition, because they were looking for green, you have the creation of white absinthe, and this is basically the same thing. It just doesn't have. They run it through the still one more time to get rid of the color, strip the color, but they still leave the proteins in here. So this absinthe will actually do what's called a louche, and we'll demonstrate that here in just a second. However, I want to say first and foremost that not all absinthes louche. This has kind of been a fallacious thing where absinthe has been tied to, if it becomes cloudy when you do it in the traditional preparation, it's a good quality absinthe, and that's not the case necessarily. This is a fantastic absinthe. I absolutely love this. I'm actually having to borrow this from Steve because my bottle is so low and I didn't get a chance to buy another bottle. I absolutely adore this stuff. It's a very good high quality absinthe, but it does not louche, and that's not necessarily a quality issue. It's just presence of the proteins in the spirit. The same thing that you see if you add a little bit of water to whiskey and you see it kind of cloud and you see those little wispy things in the whiskey. It's the same exact thing. You're just seeing proteins denaturing when you're adding cold water. So let's have a look at this. So I have two louching absinthes, and again my non-louching green absinthe. So we'll start here, and let's go off over here. This is Oregon Spirit, and the traditional preparation is exactly like this. You have a fountain that has ice water in it. That's all that's in this container here. And we have a sugar cube over top of a slotted spoon called an absinthe spoon. And then down here in the reservoir at the bottom, you have that beautiful emerald green absinthe. Alrighty, so what we're going to do is we're going to turn this on to a slow drip, and it's going to wash over the spoon. Whoop, a little bit right there. Pull that back just a touch. And as you can actually starting to see the denaturing of the proteins down there. And this is going to very quickly start clouding up. There's our louche. Alrighty. So as you can see, it louches and becomes cloudy. And I'm going to cut that off. Move this off to the side here. Alrighty, so now let's do a white absinthe. Now this is going to louche as well, but it's going to not have that green color. It's going to keep more of a white color. You can see that already happening there. And that is just beautiful. I absolutely love that. And again, your louching absinthe. Now finally, we have a non-louching absinthe. This is the Holy Stone. This is Utah's only absinthe distillery. So you can see a little bit of the denaturing proteins there, but there's not enough to actually cloud up. It is beautiful nevertheless, and it is an amazing absinthe. Again, the presence or lack thereof of a louche is in no way, shape, or form an indicator of the quality of the absinthe. It really just comes down to the spirit itself, and you can't know unless you taste it. It's basically what it comes down to here. And there we go. That is 3 different absinthes. Okay, so as you can see, we have our 3 different absinthes here. We have our louching green, our non-louching green, and our white absinthe. So obviously our white one is this one here, the La Clandestine. That definitely is named based off of the fact that this was designed to get around the bans on absinthe at the time, the whole black market thing. Utah's only absinthe here, the non-Lucian green, and then Oregon Spirit, also fantastic absinthe. So yeah, let's try these. These are, again, it is wormwood, very forward. It's, if you don't like black licorice, you're not going to like absinthe. It is a very polarizing spirit. It is one that either you love or you hate. There is no in between here. The wormwood is very, very herbal and plays very well with the other botanicals that are present. A little bit of bitter on the finish, but the sweetness cuts the bitter a lot and presents a cocktail that is very well balanced. I guess it's not technically a cocktail, but a drink that is very well balanced between bitter, herbal, sweet, and it all just ties so well together in the traditional preparation. I have drank, I don't know how many glasses this way. I absolutely adore my absinthe fountain. They're amazing things to have, and it just makes the experience so much nicer. And as you saw with the Luche, it is just beautiful to sit and just watch that slowly cloud up as it consumes the glass. So let's move forward. So this one is actually going to be a little bit sweeter. The more modern absinthes are a little bit on the sweeter side. This one here, the Holy Stone Apparition Absinthe, is going to be less sweet. This is going to be closer to the traditional absinthes. The lead distiller of Holy Stone actually met with someone who had some pre-prohibition absinthes that he got to try, and he patterned it based off of that. So this is why I say this is not necessarily a quality thing that it doesn't Luche. It is going to be a little bit less sweet, so you're going to have a little bit more of the bitter. The sugar cube is just standard. But that the less sweet doesn't mean that it's more bitter necessarily. It's extremely balanced. You have the herbal. It is still very potent. The wormwood on that kind of numbs your tongue just a little bit. And the more you drink of it, the less you start tasting, unfortunately. But it's not. This one actually ends up being less bitter than the Oregon Spirit. It is less sweet, but it's also less bitter, and the other botanicals actually sit very far forward. It's not just being smacked in the face with a bag of black licorice. There's a lot of other things here. It's a lot like a fantastic Amaro in that way, where it's got a little bit of the bitter, but it's got mostly herbal notes that are from other botanicals that are also present here. And it is, again, I've been through so many bottles of this stuff, I can't keep it in my house. It is just amazing. And finally, we have the La Clandestine Absinthe, the White Absinthe here. And because it was distilled a final time to remove the green from the wormwood and the thujone, the thujone is still there. The green from the wormwood itself is removed. You don't have as much of that. You don't have as much of the licorice bite. It is very similar. It's actually very similar to the Holy Stone Absinthe in that it's not as bitter. It is a little bit sweeter than the Holy Stone, but it's not as bitter, and it ends up being kind of like a licorice candy almost, without. It kind of ends up being a little bit one-dimensional per se. It's not something that I would necessarily seek out. I bought this bottle specifically to film this so that way I had an excuse to show off a white absinthe. I don't know that I would necessarily buy this and keep it around. This I would absolutely keep around. This I would absolutely keep around. This one is a little bit one-dimensional, and it's done so that way you could get around the prohibition of the era. So there you go. That's absinthe. Keep the spirits.